Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
They call this a budget fit for the future. The reality is, this is a government no longer fit for office.
Stamp duty for first-time buyers on properties up to £300,000 will be scrapped, except in Scotland. Experts are warning it could put house prices up. We'll bring you all the details of the budget and who are the winners and losers. Fit for the future. That's what the Chancellor has promised in today's budget. It had a few giveaways, but was delivered against the backdrop of a faltering economy with lower than expected growth and falling productivity. Among Philip Hammond's announcements, from now, first-time buyers in England, Wales and Northern Ireland will pay no stamp duty on homes up to £300,000. More in London. Scotland has a different system. For the NHS in England, the Chancellor promised an extra £1.6 billion over the next year, though that's still short of what the NHS says it needs. The wait for the welfare benefit universal credit, which has attracted criticism from both sides of the House, has been reduced from 6 weeks to 5. But it's all set against a downgrade in how much the economy is expected to grow over the next 5 years, with growth in 2017 alone cut from 2% to 1.5%. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, said the budget would unravel within days and misery would continue for people across the country. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, now on the facts and figures, the winners and losers in today's budget.
Almost ready to go. A big day for Downing Street, whose grip for months has been shaky, to say the least.
Feeling the pressure, Chancellor?
The priority for number 10 and 11. Those powerful next-door neighbours.
Is this a make-or-break budget?
Was for today's events not to slip, to keep the budget tightly within their grasp. For the Chancellor, the aim to be the steady national bank manager, not to tear up the rules altogether. Knowing his own job, as well as the government's fortunes, would be shaped by what he was about to say.
Philip Hammond.
A cheerier start than Mr Hammond's usual demeanour suggests.
I report today on an economy that continues to grow, continues to create more jobs than ever before, and continues to confound those who seek to talk it down. And in this budget, we express our resolve to look forwards, not backwards.
Yet with Brexit hanging over him, the risks of no deal with the rest of the EU, real and expensive.
Today, I am setting aside over the next 2 years another £3 billion, and I stand ready to allocate further sums if and when needed.
He wasn't gambling, though, with his ability to get through the speech. Remember hers?
I did take the precaution of asking my right honourable friend to bring a packet of cough sweets, just in case.
But he had to reflect the worry felt by many around the country and fess up to the fact the economy will be sluggish for longer, the country overall less wealthy for years. The first time there's been this kind of prediction since 1983.
They revised down the outlook for productivity growth, business investment and GDP growth across the forecast period.
What ministers want you to hear is their promise to spend billions more to get house building going and to make it cheaper to buy the first time.
Deputy Speaker, when we say we will revive the home-owning dream in Britain, we mean it. We do not underestimate the scale of the challenge, but today we have made a substantial down payment.
One of the few surprises, stamp duty will be scrapped for good for those buying for the first time on properties up to the value of £300,000. But it might only prompt around 3,000 extra buyers and could push prices up.
So we will increase targeted...
And after Tory concern joined other parties' opposition, the Chancellor promised to smooth the sharpest edges of the new benefit, universal credit.
Universal credit delivers a modern welfare system where work always pays and people are supported to earn. But I recognise, Mr Deputy Speaker, the genuine concerns on both sides of the House about the operational delivery of this benefit.
The controversial benefit won't be paused But families won't have to wait so long to receive the payment when they first claim. And they'll be able to stay on housing benefits for longer. There is cash for more maths teachers, for research and development, but no extra money for care for the elderly. The health service in England, though, will get an extra £2.8 billion in the next couple of years, far less than its bosses say it needs. But the government will find more money to give nurses a pay rise next year. With no obvious clangers so far from the Chancellor, the government hopes this can steady Tory nerves.
We are at a turning point in our history, and we resolve to look forwards, not backwards, to seize the opportunities ahead of us, and together to build a Britain fit for the future. I commend this statement to the House.
A sigh of relief from the Chancellor, but obvious anger from the Labour leader. Not enough to change much, he claimed, and not enough for millions in need.
Economic growth has been revised down. Productivity growth has been revised down. Business investment revised down. People's wages and living standards revised down. What sort of strong economy is that? What sort of fit for the future is that? They call this a budget fit for the future. The reality is, this is a government no longer fit for office.
Remember, the government barely has a majority when it needs it, so opposition parties can make life extremely hard.
He has deluded. When you look at the OBR book, the fiscal stimulus from this is 0.1%. It is nothing.
Living standards are going to be severely curtailed. We've got a very severe squeeze continuing in public services.
The economic growth was downgraded, business investment was downgraded, and productivity was downgraded as a result of this budget, and that will mean a further squeeze on wages and living standards.
A squeeze that will hang over firms and families around the country. A backdrop that the government at Westminster will find hard to escape. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, the government's goal of balancing the budget is looking increasingly remote. The previous Conservative Chancellor, George Osborne, had pledged to eliminate the deficit, that is the difference between what the government earns and what it spends, to zero by 2015. Then it was kicked back to 2025. Now even that is in doubt. The budget has revealed that borrowing over the next 5 years will, on average, be higher than previously forecast. Andy Verity is here to talk us through the numbers. Andy.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Well, it wasn't really Philip Hammond who had the biggest influence on this budget. It was Robert Choate, the man who makes the official predictions about how quickly the economy will grow. Now, before the financial crash, each worker would produce about 2% more than they did the year before. For years, Mr. Choate expected that growth in productivity to return, but it didn't. Now he's been forced to admit it's not going to happen.
But the basic judgment we have to make about productivity is what weight do you put on this unusually weak period that we've seen since the financial crisis, and a much stronger period of performance for decades before that. And economists really don't know what the explanation for the weak period is. There's a whole variety of things that could have been contributing over time: very low interest rates, weak investment, problems in the financial sector, maybe the output of the economy is being undermeasured. But we basically have to take an overall judgment, and we've been more pessimistic than we were back in March.
Here's the scale of the damage that weak productivity is expected to do to the growth of the economy, meaning all the goods and services we produce. Now, in the spring, the OBR thought we'd grow by 2% this year, then slow down before speeding back up again 5 years from now. Here's the new realistic forecast: average growth of just 1.4% a year, a slowdown that won't go away.
Well, I think if the projections are correct, that would mean that we'll see a very slight slowdown. We're growing at about 1.5 to 1.7% now. The slowdown would be down to 1.4, 1.3. But quite frankly, that's within the margin of error of any economic forecast. So I think it's a sobering projection.
Now, if the economy is growing more slowly, the income tax and VAT doesn't roll in as fast, so the Chancellor has to borrow more to plug the gap between his income and his spending. Here's what he was forecast to have to borrow back in March. Now, he won't have to borrow as much in the short term because the economy's done better than expected since the Brexit vote. But 5 years from now, he'll be borrowing a lot more. Now, in spite of that, the Chancellor chose to spend more. Take next year, when he'll spend an extra £1.5 billion preparing for Brexit. And he'll miss out on £0.8 billion by freezing fuel duty. Taking all the measures in the budget, it's a net giveaway of more than £6 billion.
It's looking increasingly unlikely that we're going to get balanced books even by the mid-2020s. The point at which we're supposed to have got to balance has been pushed back and back and back. And actually, just to get there in the mid-2020s, we'd have to have another round of spending cuts over the early 2020s. Given how hard it's been to get where we are, I think that's going to be pretty tough.
Underlying all the Treasury's numbers are assumptions that we'll leave the EU in March 2019, that immigration will be cut, that imports and exports won't grow as fast. And each of those assumptions is deeply uncertain. Andy Verity, BBC News.
In terms of the housing crisis, the government has pledged to build an average of 300,000 new homes a year, but not until the middle of the next decade. Stamp duty in England, Wales and Northern Ireland is to be abolished immediately for first-time buyers on properties worth up to £300,000, more in London. Our home editor, Mark Easton, has more.
It was billed as a watershed budget that would fix the broken housing market. So we've come to a new development in Newbury in West Berkshire.
Today we set out an ambitious plan.
Watching the Chancellor in the show house here, we've got house hunters in the bedroom, a worried resident in the kitchen,
Purpose-built private rented sector.
and a housing association in the living room. The headline announcement was the abolition of stamp duty on the first £300,000 of a home sale. Now, the average house price in West Berkshire is currently over £356,000. So has the Chancellor put a smile on the faces of working couple Charlie and Sophie, who have a baby coming and need somewhere to start the family?
It's good that stamp duty looks like it's going to save us a bit of money, but actually I'm a little bit worried that it's going to put house prices further up.
And I think that's the main issue for people like us, is house prices are so high that we just can't afford to save a deposit.
The Office for Budget Responsibility tonight warned the stamp duty change will only lead to an extra 3,500 first-time buyer purchases. The Chancellor did say today he wants 300,000 new homes built in England every year. The last time 300,000 homes were built in a year in England was back in 1969, when councils and housing associations built almost half of them. What was your take-out from the budget?
I think the headline 44 billion is good news. Devil's in the detail. The main two takeouts for me are around employment training, so we've got the people there to build the new homes, and secondly, universal credit changes to support our residents pay their rent.
Just up the road is the other side of the housing story. Appropriately, the inspiration for the book Watership Down, these fields had been due to become 2,000 desperately needed homes. But after local protests and rows over infrastructure, the council has pulled the plans. So how do those worried about new development view this budget?
We welcome the protection of Greenbelt. We welcome the emphasis on brownfield development, high-density housing for towns and cities, but worry about the 300,000 target as to the pressure this puts on councils to push forward unsuitable schemes.
The Prime Minister says fixing the broken housing market is her mission. So in this rich corner of the home counties, how many children are homeless tonight? The answer? 87. Mark Easton, BBC News, West Berkshire.
All more money has been promised for the health service, nearly £3 billion over 3 years for the NHS in England, and £350 million immediately to address pressures this winter. But NHS England's medical director, Sir Bruce Keogh, says the money isn't enough and longer waits for patients seem unavoidable. Our health editor, Hugh Pym, reports.
The neonatal intensive care unit at Birmingham Women's Hospital. Here they have a clear view what future generations will need from the NHS. The Chief Executive says the Chancellor's new funding falls short of what's required.
I feel quite sad about it, if I'm honest. I was really looking for the government to make a commitment to what the NHS needs in the long term.
She told me the money for this winter has come too late.
It's very difficult to think what we can do now. The only thing we could really try is to get additional locum staff or to pay existing staff overtime. But it's the same pool that we're asking to do extra work all the time.
NHS England had called for a major funding increase. The budget deal fell short of that, but health commentators said it was a step in the right direction.
It's less than we need, but it's more than we expected. There are huge challenges out there on the front line, not just for acute hospitals, but also for mental health, community and ambulance services.
NHS employers say the government's pay cap policy has made it increasingly difficult to recruit and retain staff. Significantly today, the Chancellor said he would find the extra money to cover any wage increase recommended by the independent pay review body.
And then you move up.
These nurses told me they had something to look forward to after many years of pay restraint.
It's massive. It's massive financially for every, struggle every month. You never, every month you're in your overdraft. There's not very many nurses have a savings fund and things like that.
It's very positive, but I just worry that it still leaves some uncertainty about what it means for the future, how much the pay rise will be.
The trust running this hospital has got new budget funding to expand its A&E unit, but a senior NHS England official has said the Chancellor hasn't plugged all the funding gap, and longer waits for care are now unavoidable, which is worrying. Hugh Pym, BBC News, Birmingham.
Some of the other measures announced in today's budget are that the personal tax-free allowance will rise to £11,850, and for high-rate taxpayers the threshold is lifted to £46,350. Duty on beer, wine, spirits and most ciders will be frozen, but duty on high-strength ciders will go up. Duty on tobacco will rise by 2% above inflation, but car tax for all but the cleanest diesel cars will go up a band from April, but no increase for vans. And there was good news for small businesses. Their threshold to pay VAT is being kept at £85,000. Well, let's talk to our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, who's at Westminster. Laura, there was so much build-up to this budget, talks of rows between number 10 and 11, dark mutterings it might cost the Chancellor his job. Has he managed to pull it off?
Well, Fiona, I think if anybody was hoping for something dramatic, huge moves in this budget, they'd have been disappointed. It was not the kind of radical reboot that some Tory MPs wanted. It was not, frankly, the kind of budget that will go down in history as the kind that could change the fortunes of the government overnight, whether being a triumph or a complete disaster. But I think, frankly, after the last 6 months of turmoil, the real aim for number 11 and number 10 today was to get through the day without accident. A quiet day these days for the Tory party is in some ways a good day. There is, however, one really big, important but to all of that. The economic predictions are worse, much worse than people had been expecting. And that means if they turn out to be correct, that for another 5 years, families and firms around the country will be feeling the squeeze. The country is now expected to be significantly less well off than previous forecasts had suggested. Now, of course, those numbers can prove to be wrong. They often do turn out to be very different. But voters tend to punish governments and political parties who preside over a period where they feel, instead of better off, that they're really feeling the pinch. And however the individual measures that Philip Hammond put forward today proceed, that backdrop is something that the government can't escape.
Laura at Westminster, thank you.
A joke about cough sweets didn't sugar the pill. The economic forecasts in Philip Hammond's second budget this year were much gloomier than those he announced in the spring. The Chancellor admitted that productivity continues to disappoint, and that meant a sharp slash in the prediction for future growth. The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said those numbers were a record of failure and showed the government was no longer fit for office. Gary Gibbon has our first budget report from Westminster.
The Chancellor opened his budget speech saying the state of the economy confounded its critics.
Feeling the pressure, Chancellor?
He knows that the revised growth forecast given by the Office for Budget Responsibility suggests the economy is entering uncharted, dangerous waters of sustained low growth. He'd been under threat by Tories who feel the party should be borrowing more and spending more to take on Labour opponents. Under threat too from Leave supporters who say he refuses to embrace Brexit. Philip Hammond did his best to fend off both camps of critics and to lighten the mood.
I'm being tempted with something a little more exotic here, but I'm going to stick to plain water. But I did take the precaution. I did take the precaution of asking my right honourable friend to bring a packet of cough sweets just in case.
The mood quickly changed, though, as he explained that low productivity had created downgraded growth forecasts. Growth now looking historically and stubbornly low.
The OBR now expects to see GDP grow 1.5% in 2017, 1.4% in 2018, 1.3% in 2019 and 2020, before picking back up to 1.5% and finally 1.6% in 2022.
One think tank says if you look at records for productivity growth, they suggest you have to go back to the time of the Napoleonic Wars to find a period to match the one we are entering.
When we step back and when the history books are written about this period, the living standards effect of this whole decade after the financial crisis is a crisis and will be remembered as such. Now, the OBR is predicting a return to some productivity growth and to slightly faster wage growth over the next few years, but it is still very sluggish and it's not going to feel like boom time Britain.
The top line of the budget was that the growth of the economy, which wasn't great, it's slowing down even further, and that's dragging down living standards. It'll be £700 a year worse off, the average individual, than was forecast before the election took place. It's dragging down government revenue, and therefore it affects the money available for public services.
The Chancellor did find some extra cash for the NHS in England, though it was less than the NHS bosses said was desperately needed.
£350 million immediately to allow trusts to plan for this winter, £1.6 billion in 2018-19, with the balance in 1920, taking the extra resource into the NHS next year to £3.75 billion in total.
Mr Hammond said the NHS would not have to pay nurses a pay rise out of that, but the pay rise is yet to be negotiated. Other departments will get no extra cash to pay their workers. After years of pay freezes and caps, a relaxation on pay is being willed, but with no extra means to provide it. There were a blizzard of housing initiatives, but not the borrow-to-build bonanza some Tories say is now necessary. His big surprise? This.
With effect from today, for all first-time buyer purchases up to £300,000, I am abolishing stamp duty altogether.
That cheered his MPs, though quite what it will achieve was widely questioned.
And together, to build a Britain fit for the future. I commend this statement to the House.
A hunted man in his own party, he sat down with a sigh. Labour said families would now suffer.
Economic growth has been revised down. Productivity growth has been revised down. Business investment revised down. People's wages and living standards revised down. What sort of strong economy is that? What sort of fit for the future is that?
What hope do millennials have to cling on to? Robbed of their housing allowance, lumbered with chronic student debt, this government has gone out of its way to avoid investing in young people. The intergenerational wealth unfairness is creating the perfect storm for future generations.
As expected, the Chancellor told Parliament he was putting money into universal credit to try to reduce the hardship of 6-week waits for benefits. Some of his own colleagues were surprised to hear at Cabinet this morning that he was making an extra £3 billion available for Brexit preparations. All that could help him stay put, even if the economic news blows others' lives and incomes off course.
In a moment, we'll look in detail at the budget plans for housing, but first, Gary Gibbon is in Westminster. Gary, how much political trouble will come from this?
Well, I think we'd all had our eyes very much on what we thought was the really big economic and political weather front, Brexit, and today was a kind of reminder that there's another weather front still out there, and that's the impact of the 2008 financial crash. And the impact that that is having ongoing on growth figures is really startling. To give you an example of what it could mean, if the new trend rate of growth is, say, 1.6, which is where the Office for Budget Responsibility say it will be at the end of this forecasting period, if it were to be that, quite a small, in percentage terms, drop from maybe where we were looking. But if you were to imagine that gap over 30 years, the country would be 30% poorer than it might have been. Now, that is an extraordinary thing when you look at it like that, and you can easily see the implications for people's wages and for public spending. And just to say those two things gives you immediate impact on what idea of what impact it could have on politics.
Well, now, was it well done, Philip Hammond? I mean, he basically escaped with his life and a few jokes.
For some of Philip Hammond's Tory colleagues, his thought crime had been to be too much of a doomster when it came to Brexit. He immediately kicked off high up in his speech, talking about the opportunities of Brexit, and he coughed up some money to help with the preparations for Brexit. The other thing that he's been accused of is not being drastic, radical enough, borrowing to spend. Some Tories have got a strange, perhaps, new appetite for that kind of approach. But I spoke to one person this evening who's probably been amongst one of his most outspoken critics, and they said they thought he'd done a lot better. They wished he'd been a bit like that before. I rather suspect that the sort of numbers, the gloomy economic forecast that he's talking about, will possibly make him more secure and add to the sort of caution which is perhaps instinctive in Theresa May.
Gary Gibbon in Westminster. Well, now, housing is already dominating the headlines, but not necessarily for the reasons the Chancellor would have hoped for. Let's go over now to our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, who is on a housing development in Bedfordshire. Siobhan.
Well, John, first-time buyers on this massive housing estate around me here now will not be paying stamp duty on almost half the properties here. That's saving of just under £2,000 on the average price of a starter home of about £220,000. Now, the Chancellor is billing this, obviously, as great news for young people, for young families saving for a deposit. House builders were certainly rubbing their hands with glee today. But no sooner had the Chancellor sat down from delivering his budget than his independent financial watchdog, the OBR, stood up and warned that his flagship policy could actually have the perverse consequence of raising house prices by fuelling demand. So that over time, John, it's existing house buyers who will end up benefiting more from this policy than first-time buyers. Now, will that lead to an embarrassing U-turn like we saw in the last budget over the national insurance fiasco? Well, that's extremely unlikely, but it certainly won't be the outcome that the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, was looking for. Solving Britain's housing crisis was the big promise of today's budget. The aim to deliver a brand new vision of the future, tackling the two perennial problems preventing millions of Britons from getting their foot on the ladder: availability and affordability. This is exactly what the Chancellor wants to see. 750 homes being built in the corridor of opportunity in Bedfordshire between Oxford and Cambridge. And while there is construction going on all around me, this site is also indicative of the problems facing Britain's housing market. Planning permission was originally granted here in 2010, yet the first spade didn't cut the earth until 2015, 5 years later.
This is the first phase. We've got about 200 houses in, and we talked about how many first-time
Peter Jordan is responsible for finding and developing new plots of land like this for one of Britain's biggest home builders. But it's not always easy.
It takes time. You can't build houses overnight. It's a complex process, but we are doing it to the best of our abilities.
From the comfort of one of his brand new starter homes, he wanted to know how Mr Hammond would deliver on his much-trailed plan to kickstart Britain's next housing boom.
So with effect from today, for all first-time buyer purchases up to £300,000, I am abolishing stamp duty altogether.
Yeah, great.
Good news?
Great news. Thanks.
Make a big difference.
Make a big difference, eh?
Places like this.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until the end of the hour-long speech that the Chancellor finally delivered his rabbit, going much further on stamp duty than had been asked for or expected. Stamp duty will now be abolished entirely for first-time buyers of properties costing up to £300,000. And in high-price areas such as London, on properties costing up to £500,000, first-time buyers won't pay stamp duty on the first £300,000 of the value. The Chancellor said that would mean stamp duty would be abolished for 80% of first-time buyers. And he pledged £44 billion of government support to get Britain building.
Are you worried at all that that 44 billion will just
somehow not end up where it should. Have you heard this sort of thing before?
I mean, we have seen that before. And the important thing is actually how it's used, where it's used, because if it can be used to harness the development industry itself to come in and do the work and get the spades in the ground, that's the thing. It's the oil in the engine to try and get productivity in houses built on the ground. If it's used properly, it could be good.
It's certainly good for first-time buyers like Lucy and Anthony, although they've just closed on their deal in another huge development up the road.
Going to make a big difference, I think, because it's already difficult enough to have to save the money for a deposit, stamp duty, for everything else you need to pay for. So just that added extra of not having to pay the stamp duty is going to make a big difference, I think. So.
The Chancellor's grand plan is to build 300,000 new homes for mainly young first-time buyers like these, up from the 217,000 achieved this year.
Alongside the abolition of stamp duty, there's no doubt the 44 billion in government support is equally eye-catching, but the devil will be in the detail. How much of it is new money as opposed to loans and guarantees? And crucially, when will it be available and how hard will it be to access? Because if all that is too complicated and too late, then there's a risk that today's big housing announcement, like so many before it, could fail.
Well, today we saw a package of short-term marginal nudges for housing, when what we really need is an almighty and immediate shove to drive up housing supply. The Chancellor has pledged to deliver 300,000 new homes a year, but it looks like that won't actually take effect until the mid-2020s, which is 8 years away. Also, a lot of the measures that were announced today won't be taking effect for at least another 2 years. So the question has to be why the wait, given the urgency of the challenge that we face.
With his finances hugely constrained by lower growth forecasts thanks to weak productivity, the Chancellor has chosen housing as the main priority of his budget, as much a political move to woo back young voters as a radical economic one, and one which may not end up delivering the real change the government desires. Siobhan Kennedy, Channel 4 News in Bedford.
So why has the economy failed to deliver for the Chancellor, and what are the implications for tax and spend? Well, we're joined by our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi. Well, Helia, what is the key story that comes out of these numbers today?
Well, it's got to be this massive downgrade to UK growth, as Gary was talking about, because for UK PLC, for the Exchequer, for each individual looking at their earnings, this is getting worse, according to the forecast. And if we take a look at how the OBR, that's the Office for Budget Responsibility, has revised its figures, in each of the years, growth has been downgraded. And in fact, when you look at each individual year, it's the first time since the OBR came up with forecasts that none of those forecast years even reaches 2%. At the moment, the UK is back of the line in the G7 nations, and it wasn't long ago that we were one of the fastest. Now, the upshot of all of that is the UK economy is going to lose almost £50 billion, and that's a massive hit.
Well, so why has growth taken such a hit? And it's not Brexit, is it?
Well, no, because the other big uncertainty about the UK economy, not just Brexit, it's productivity, and something that nobody quite understands. But today, the OBR decided they were going to take an axe to their expectations of UK productivity. And quite frankly, it's been a long time coming, because this has been a battle between hope on the one hand and reality on the other. And if we take a look at productivity, you can see before the crisis, productivity was going at quite a pace, but then it's been flatlining for almost a decade. And that's why the OBR's March estimates, which is the line you can see now, that looked increasingly unrealistic compared to the direction of travel that the UK economy seemed to be heading towards. Well, today they settled for something in the middle. And even with this halfway house downgrade, it means an extra £90 billion of borrowing.
So what does this mean for the public finances? I mean, and eliminating the deficit itself?
Well, I'm afraid that's going to be put on the back burner, because the whole of this weaker productivity outlook means that the Chancellor's plans for eliminating the deficit by 2025 has had to be cancelled. The OBR now thinks that the deficit won't be eliminated till 2030 or perhaps even later. And it's quite interesting that just at this time that forecasts are getting worse, the Chancellor has also decided to spend more money. Remember, this is a giveaway budget to the tune of £25 billion. But before you celebrate that it's the end of austerity, it's worth remembering that all the planned cuts to government departments and the squeeze on welfare, well, that's all still in there.
Well, Halia Ibrahimi. Well, now, in a moment, we'll be talking with the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, Debbie Abrahams. But first, I'm joined by the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Mel Stride. Mel Stride, quite an achievement to be slashing growth forecasts when the global economy is enjoying its, well, most synchronized recovery since 2007. And our biggest trading partner has the best growth in a decade.
Well, our economy is strong, John. We have record levels of employment. We have the lowest unemployment since 1975. We're coming into this period on the back of 4.5 years of sustained, continuous economic growth. And as you've seen in your clip, the OBR is predicting that the economy will continue to grow over the next 5 years.
So they're quite wrong. The Chancellor's quite wrong to be slashing growth forecasts, quite wrong to be talking about productivity. It's all marvellous.
No. Productivity is certainly an issue. It has been an issue and is an issue, in fact, for all major economies since the financial crash. It has been depressed and difficult, not just in the UK, but overseas. But that is why, in the budget today, the Chancellor was so forthright and strong on tackling productivity. So what we're going to be doing is investing. We've got 23 billion in our National Productivity Investment Fund. We're raising that to 31 billion pounds, and we'll be investing in areas like housing that you've been featuring on the programme this evening,
but you know, people are going to
and the things we need to move the economy forward.
This is what brings television into bad, well, and politicians into bad repute. You show figures on the wall, which you were here to see, where there has been a complete readjustment of our forecast for growth. And it's down, severely down, 25% down.
Yeah.
So, but you're talking it up.
Well, what I'm pointing out is that we have had 4.5 years of continuous growth. We will have growth over the next 5 years.
Yeah, but worse than it was predicted in March.
Look,
did you see that great dip?
If the question you were asking me is what is the cause of the downgrade, the substantial component of that is productivity.
You mean we've been so successful that now we must crash?
No, that is why in the budget we are focusing on putting far more money in, billions of pounds extra, into the drivers of productivity. So that's skills, that's infrastructure, that's housing that you've been featuring, that's innovation, new technology, the new industries of the future, and that's where that investment is going. Now, nobody is suggesting this is going to be resolved overnight, either here or in any other countries for that matter, because there are many countries that are struggling with this issue post-2008.
But
what we've done today is we've set out those clear plans for getting on top of this going forward.
But you seem to be in denial about the fact that we are actually going down when everyone else is going up.
Well, we have, as I said,
we're growing slower than any of our competitors, not one of them in the G8 or G7 as it now is, and not one of them in the major economies.
We have growth going forward. We have a balanced budget, which allows still some headroom as we move towards eliminating the deficit. And let's not forget that we've eliminated 3/4 of the deficit since we came to power in 2010. The OBR has also said that those intermediate targets that we have on getting the deficit down and debt down as a percentage of GDP.
But that's incredible. I mean,
we will meet,
just
to finish off, John, we will meet those targets 2 years early. So we have a balanced budget.
We're not talking the same language.
Well,
we're simply not talking the same language.
If you look
he has extended the moment when we will pay off our deficit by a factor of a decade. And you're saying we're going to pay it off 2 years early.
I'm referring, no, I didn't say that. I said the interim targets, which are 2020-21 targets, as you will know,
yes.
Bringing the deficit down below 2% and a falling level of debt as a percentage of GDP. And those targets, the OBR says, we will reach 2 years early, in other words, next year. But nobody's suggesting there's not a challenge here. But
your old friend George Osborne
it's a balanced
said
budget.
We would pay off the deficit first in 2015. Well, that got shot. Then he said 2019. And today, the figures indicate we will pay it off in 2031. That's according to the Office for Budget Responsibility. So surely to suggest anything else is irresponsible.
The answer to this in the medium term is to get growth driven by productivity improvements. And as I've been trying to explain, we have today set out very clear, well-funded proposals for doing just that. The other thing that we recognise is that we've had squeezed households in the short term, So that's why we're freezing fuel duty, which will be £150 worth of benefit to the average motorist. We've put up today the personal allowances for tax, so that will help particularly the lowest paid. And we're going to be increasing in April by 4.4% the national living wage. And those are important things that we can do now. But we have to be responsible on the finances whilst trying to ease the pressure.
Let's get into some detail here. Look, we've got ending stamp duty, which you're very proud of. But the fact is, the Office for Budget Responsibility, who were not keen on this, they said this is going to have the effect of raising house prices by 0.3%. Agreed?
OK. They
yes
say,
or no?
Yes, they do say that, but they say it in isolation, in the sense that, of course, there are a number of measures in this budget about increasing supply.
Look,
and
it's going to benefit current owners.
But it's important,
it's going to
John,
benefit
that we have
current owners whose houses are going to get more expensive.
It's going to benefit predominantly younger people, first-time buyers who have this barrier of having to find this stamp duty lump sum up front. It will allow them to get into the housing market by abolishing that stamp duty up to the level of £300,000. But to get back to your earlier point
No, I need to move on. Brexit. Now, no mention of Brexit here, except that he's going to spend £3 billion on the preparations for Brexit. Now, that's not going to be the erecting of custom posts or anything like that. What is it going to be for?
Well, it's going to be for all the preparations that the government may have to make.
You mean all the accountants, all the lawyers, all the consultants?
Depending on where the deal with our European partners lands. Now, that could be anything from, we don't expect it to be, a no-deal situation. We really don't expect it to be.
So this could be his insurance for a no-deal?
Well, if there wasn't that sum of money in the budget, with respect, John, you'd be saying to me, well, why isn't he making provision for the various outcomes that could occur?
I mean, if in fact he said, I'm putting in a war chest in case we don't get a deal, that'd be one thing. But actually, this is for bureaucrats, for lawyers, for accountants, for all sorts of consultants to come in and help you do this thing.
No. Well, one of the areas, let's look specifically at one area, customs. Okay, we don't know what the customs arrangements currently will be when we exit the European Union. We don't know whether we'll have a transitional 2-year period, for example. Now, if on day one we have to be ready, we will have the IT systems there, we will have the people there, we will have the infrastructure there to make sure that our
So this is about infrastructure. This is about putting up customs posts and all that, and all the electronic surveillance.
Well, this is about, if we end up, and I don't believe that we will, but if we ended up in a situation where the EU was effectively a third country, as we currently trade with other countries outside the EU, then you would expect, quite right, and the public would expect us to be ready on day one. And what we're saying is we will put the money down to make sure that that happens.
Mel Stride, thank you very much for coming in. Krishnan?
Thanks, John. Well, joining me now is Debbie Abrahams, Labour's Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary. Let's start where they were talking, this £3 billion for Brexit preparations. Seeing as you backed the government on all these key votes, you'd be spending it too, wouldn't you?
We need to make sure that we are prepared for whatever the outcome. It's very interesting to see, though,
that you back the £3 billion. Let's just be clear.
We
it's an awful lot of money.
We need to make sure that we are prepared for whatever the outcome of those negotiations are. It's interesting in the OBR report that they are assuming that a deal is made, and that, with the shambolic negotiations that we've seen so far, is not guaranteed.
That's another interview. But we've established you would also spend that £3 billion on accountants and consultants. Let's talk about the stamp duty idea that has been trashed by the Office of Budget Responsibility today. They say it probably will only cause another 3,500 purchases that wouldn't happen before. It will cause a bottleneck at 500,000. It will cause house prices to rise. It will benefit homeowners more than first-time buyers. Good idea?
Well, it was actually part of Labour's manifesto,
yes.
probably, but we need
Your
to see
idea,
it coupled.
Wasn't it?
We need to see it coupled with making sure that we increase the supply. The point that I think that John was making, we're not sure within the measures that the government has proposed today that that's going to be the case.
But why was Labour proposing an idea that is better for people who own properties than people who want to buy them? They've nicked your clothes.
But they haven't got the total package. And to be fair, they also haven't addressed the real issue around affordable housing and social housing within their measures.
Which you would have done what?
Which we committed to in the additional house building programme that we would have introduced. And it was one of the things that we asked for within the budget. We would have made sure that at least half of the homes that are built are social.
OK, so you back the £3 billion. It was your idea on the stamp duty. This is a spending budget as well, isn't it? And a borrowing budget. This sounds like a Labour budget.
But it hasn't gone, you know, if we take my own area, Chris, if we look at what's happened around universal credit, it's a good start. But first of all, it's delayed, it's not going to be introduced until next year. It's only a tenth of what the government have actually cut, and it's still not going to prevent people going into poverty. Nothing
it's
around public
light,
sector
is my point. You back up lots of things that have been done today, and you say, well, we'd have done that, but we'd have gone further.
It's no change, really. It's no change. If we look at what's around the NHS, 2.8 billion, it's not going to go anywhere to address the real issues that we are seeing within the health service. We know that 30,000 excess deaths because of the cuts to the health service in 2015 alone. Nothing for social care, nothing for public sector workers, which again would boost the economy. We know by just under a billion rather.
So. If you support the government on quite a lot of things, we know that you'd like to spend a lot on benefits. Let's come back to the Brexit question, because a lot of business investment is based on confidence. And what business now knows is that Labour's basically on the same page as the government, isn't it?
Well, I'd say it's the other way around. Given that we did so well within the general election and the manifesto that we produced, which is around really transformational. So, for example, infrastructure, nothing really that matches what we are intending to do around infrastructure. The 250 billion National Transformational Fund, which would have a huge
but on
difference.
Brexit, did you vote to rule out staying in the customs union and the single market?
No.
Right, but your party, that was your party's position, wasn't it?
Yes, yes. To stay
so
in
you defined your party's position.
We needed to have. We recognise that we need to have transitional arrangements, which is much what Mrs May said in her Florence speech. It seems to have backtracked a little bit, but it is a customs union, not necessarily the same customs union that we have to have at the moment.
So you think Jeremy Corbyn was wrong on that, in that vote?
We recognise that we need to have a position where we are in recognising the transition that we need to have. We're not going to have the negotiated settlement that we want by 2019. We need to have those extra months to be able to ensure we have the right negotiations.
Debbie Abrahams, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Welcome back. Now, the one thing public sector workers were hoping from today's budget was a pay rise after caps and freezes over the last 7 years. There were also calls for dramatic changes to universal credit after people had been left for weeks without any money at all. So did the Chancellor deliver? Our social affairs editor, Jackie Long, has been to the northeast of England to find out.
Away from Westminster, the budget can feel far removed from daily lives. The performance played out elsewhere. But here there were real and pressing issues people hoped the Chancellor would address to help make those daily lives less of a struggle.
A prosperous and inclusive economy where everybody has the opportunity to shine, wherever in these islands they live.
Callum Bell is doing his best to shine. A few years ago he worked in the co-op but retrained as a mental health nurse. Working round-the-clock shifts, he takes home under £1,500 a month. About to become a father for the second time, things are tight.
Each month it's getting increasingly more difficult, dipping into my savings a little bit more, getting closer to my overdraft each month. You're getting halfway through the month and you're thinking, how am I going to manage that last little month? And then that's not including all the life hiccups that happen.
The Chancellor's promise to fund any pay rise recommended for nurses by the Pay Review Board is not, however, the outcome he hoped for.
I don't want it to be just about nurses, because my role relies on so many other public sector staff, social workers, admin staff, support workers. They do an absolutely fantastic job. It isn't just about nurses.
At the Kilmarnock Road Family Centre in Hartlepool, news that universal credit claims may be speeded up by a week is greeted with indifference. Mother of 3, Kimberly Rudd, waited 5 weeks. She says any wait is too long.
It was horrible to wait for me. I was so worried that I had to try and find rent. I had to try and cover me food for the kids. I had to cover gas and electric for a month. It was just horrible waiting that period of time to get a first payment, and then I didn't even know till just before how much we were actually going to get.
Steve Swainston is on holiday from his job at the Department for Work and Pensions, where he tries to make sure the benefit system works properly for people. He says the public sector pay cap has left him and many colleagues struggling.
The fact that the universal credit's been brought in across the country, and there's a number of people in the civil service who are actually claiming universal credit themselves, it does make you question as to whether the pay that we are receiving is sufficient.
And how much longer do you think you can keep going, feeling squeezed like this?
Well, let's hope that it won't go on for too much longer, but I think that it can only go on for so long before there's a reaction from the workforce in general, and I think that that's the more likely outcome, unless we actually get something to tackle the problems that we're experiencing. Then I think that there's a genuine possibility that there might be some wider action, some wider fight back from the public sector unions.
This region stands to benefit from a new devolution deal, including £600 million of extra funding. But boosting public sector pay across the board was not part of the Chancellor's balancing act, much to the disappointment of many here, where around a fifth of the workforce work in the public sector.
It's expensive. Every time he raises pay across the public sector by 1%, it's costing taxpayers a lot of money. He's saying simply, we can't afford it at the moment.
Yeah, but in reality, public sector workers are also taxpayers. So we know, and it's evidence, that continuing public sector pay restraint means that public sector workers aren't earning enough often now to be able to make ends meet.
The Chancellor, though, insisted today this was an inclusive budget to improve life for everyone. Skills, health, housing. Some here are yet to be convinced.
Well, as we've been reporting, the Chancellor scrapped stamp duty for first-time buyers on properties costing up to £300,000 and promised to build 300,000 new homes a year by the middle of the next decade. Joining me in the studio now is Conservative MP Bob Blackman and the journalist in Norfolk, Dawn Foster. The chairman of the Local Government Association, Lord Porter, also joins us from Westminster. Lord Porter, was this a missed opportunity of a budget?
It was a mixed bag of a budget. There were chances for him to actually fix the housing crisis, and whilst he's made some positive moves, I don't think they've gone far enough to be able to fix it.
You still can't build the council houses you want to?
Some of our members will be able to borrow a bit more money. What we should have had is a scrapping of the whole system. Council houses should be seen as an asset, not as a liability.
Bob Blackman, why did Theresa May say she was going to take personal charge of the housing crisis and then come up with such a feeble set of measures?
Well, the reality is that we've committed to building 300,000 properties a year over a 5-year period. Now,
that's about 70,000 more.
Well, 70,000 more
by the middle of next decade.
No. From this year, which we're building 220,000 in the last year, that's increased in this.
Okay, 80,000,
and therefore going to go up. Well, the reality is that that's the highest level of house building there's been in this country for 40 years. So for decades, unfortunately, governments of all persuasions have failed to build the number of properties we need. So that's why we need to build far more than actually just to stand still.
Dawn Foster, I mean, it's a bit embarrassing that this stamp duty idea was a Labour idea.
I mean, it is embarrassing, but at the same time, I mean, it's very, very embarrassing for the government to come out and announce that they want to halve homelessness, by the middle of next decade, when actually they've more than doubled homelessness since they came in. So all they're doing there is going back on their problem. But I think the big issue is that nobody except existing homeowners is in a good position. So you scrap stamp duty, you save £5,000 for first-time buyers, but actually, the house prices will go up, the OBR have said. So all that happens is that,
It's good for homeowners then, isn't it?
Good for homeowners, not for people who want to get on the ladder.
But equally hidden in the budget, which he didn't actually announce in his speech, but actually is in the budget, is help to rent, which is coming in as part and parcel of the budget proposals. That will help more than 20,000 families across this country every single year get the deposit together to rent a property. That's got to be good news.
Which is also good for landlords. I mean, this is a classic Tory budget, isn't it? Because the economic growth is fading off. So what you've done is you've put a stimulus into the housing market and helped people who own property who are worried about their house prices.
No, the key is that we're going to be creating more properties for people to be able to get into either a home to buy or a home to rent. There's £44 billion in this budget for the development of new housing. I mean, that's got to be good news. I think the abolition of stamp duty is great news for first-time buyers, and that's got to be good news. It's good news for renters. And overall, of course, there's always an argument of saying, do more. Well, I think what the Chancellor has done today is take the first strategic steps on a proper housing programme for this country, the like of which we've never seen, frankly, in our lifetimes.
Lord Porter, did you see that?
It's a good first step, but it shouldn't be seen as the final part of the journey. We know by history the only chance we've got of hitting 300,000 homes a year is by freeing councils up and let them build again. It's the only time we've ever done it. This country only builds enough homes when councils are allowed to play a major part.
Why haven't you done that?
Well, one of the things that we are doing is making sure...
No, why haven't you?
Well, no, the key, I think, here is that borrowing limits have been raised for certain local councils, as Lord Porter says, but not for all. What is happening, though... Well, what is happening...
No, just not what... He said you should do it. I'm asking you why aren't...
Well, the other part of this is getting housing associations, who are the major provider now of social housing in this country,
Bob, that's
to
a
spend
failed
their
experiment.
money.
We've seen for the last 40 years where they were the main provider of social housing. They haven't built enough.
No, that's why we've got to put umph into them to make them do it.
Only councils building will get to the 300,000 units a year. It's a good first step by raising the cap on some councils, but we need to scrap the cap.
Dawn Foster, where is the radicalism in any of the ideas we've heard today from any of the political parties?
There isn't any whatsoever. The Conservatives have for too long said that we can leave it to the market, but the market has completely broken the housing system here.
Did you hear it from Labour? Did you hear a compelling idea from Labour on how to solve this problem today?
I mean, well, in the manifesto, Labour said we need to get back to a mass council house building programme. And when the Conservatives came in 2010, we were building 38,000 socially rented homes. It was close to 6,000 last year. The big issue is the Conservatives came in and decided that rather than look at social rent, they would bring in affordable rent, which is 80% of market rate. That's not affordable. We need lots of council house building. We need to stop putting in these false stimuluses into the market and actually make housing more affordable by building council housing.
I'm sorry I've lost the sound in this studio.
Well, we're actually almost out of time, so I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there anyway. Lord Porter, thank you very much for joining us. Bob Blackman and Dawn Foster, thank you both for coming in.
You won't have missed the fact that the last decade has basically been one long, slow crawl out of the mess the financial crash put us in. But one day we were told it was all going to be worth it. The real news of today was, I'm afraid, that this moment still looks a very long way off. As growth accelerates in Europe and elsewhere, it is actually falling back here. And as for balancing the budget, which is what the last 7 years was supposed to have been all about, well, goodness knows when or even if that's going to happen. 2030, said the government's official watchdog today. Maybe. All that said, there was plenty in this budget, which seems to have effectively ditched austerity. The Chancellor's most dramatic move was a cut in stamp duty for first-time buyers, his most expensive, setting aside £3 billion for Brexit preparations, and arguably the most popular, at least some more money for the NHS.
His second budget in a year, the last one in March, was a personal disaster because of an unpopular national insurance rise.
Feeling the pressure, Chancellor?
And after that general election called by his boss, Theresa May, that cost the Tories their majority, he can't afford any more accidents.
I now call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Right Honourable Philip Hammond.
But no belt or braces.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I report today on an economy that continues to grow, continues to create more jobs than ever before, and continues to confound those who seek to talk it down.
He changed his tune shortly after that, but first he put on some Brexit braces.
We have already invested almost £700 million in Brexit preparations, and today I am setting aside over the next 2 years another £3 billion, and I stand ready to allocate further sums if and when needed.
Then he took out another insurance policy against the spluttering disaster that befell the Prime Minister at a party conference.
I did take the precaution of asking my right honourable friend to bring a packet of cough sweets, just in case.
But then came the economic news, which showed why we all need a bit of medicine. Productivity, the amount we produce for each hour worked, isn't growing as it should, and that means we'll all be poorer.
Regrettably, our productivity performance continues to disappoint. It has remained stubbornly flat. So today, they revised down the outlook for productivity growth business investment and GDP growth across the forecast period.
So how bad is it? Well, the Chancellor forecast that the economy would grow for years at half its speed in the 15 years before the banking crash.
The OBR now expects to see GDP grow 1.5% in 2017, 1.4% in 2018, 1.3% in 2019 and 2020.
As a country, we're a lot poorer than we expected to be. But the Chancellor found money to improve young people's skills in IT and maths.
More maths for everyone. Mr. Speaker, don't let anyone say I don't know how to show the nation a good time.
And as for an NHS crying out for cash...
First, we will deliver an additional £10 billion package of capital investment in frontline services over the course of this Parliament. But we also recognise that the NHS is under pressure right now. I am therefore exceptionally and outside the spending review process making an additional commitment of resource funding of £2.8 billion.
There was some softening of the initial cost for poorer households when their benefits are amalgamated into the single new universal credit payment. And the other priority was to increase the supply of houses from just over 200,000 new homes a year to 300,000, and to try to help young people get on the housing ladder.
So with effect from today, for all first-time buyer purchases up to £300,000, I am abolishing stamp duty altogether.
But he wasn't cheered up.
Where is the money to fund the pay rise? The Chancellor has not been clear today, not for NHS workers, our police, firefighters, teachers, teaching assistants, bin collectors, tax collectors or armed forces personnel. They call this a budget fit for the future. The reality is this is a government no longer fit for office.
What was it all about? Well, the Foreign Secretary had no doubts.
Stamp duty.
Which means that a beleaguered Chancellor probably won't be evicted from this place, well, for now at least. Robert Peston, News at 10.
It was only back in March in the spring budget that Mr Hammond told us growth would be running at around 2%. The Office for Budget Responsibility now says it will, as you just heard, be around 1.5%. But the point is it has fallen back across the entire forecast period. It means, of course, less tax, less money for public services and less for balancing the books. You may recall we were supposed to do that by 2015. Now it might happen by 2031, a mere 16 years out. So what is going wrong?
The rush hour in Leeds tonight. Commuters headed home slowly to the news that our future economic growth is also stuck in heavy traffic. Congested roads are thought to be one reason why economic productivity is so sluggish, and unless it can be revived, then our future prospects look dimmer.
Back in March, the Office for Budget Responsibility forecast our economy would grow by 2% this year and fairly steadily thereafter. But look at how those forecasts have been cut today. Lower growth every year for the next 5 years. Lower future productivity growth is to blame. From the 1950s, output per worker in the UK grew pretty consistently, right up to the financial crisis in 2008. Since when, and for reasons that aren't exactly clear, it has flatlined. Well, today the OBR decided productivity is unlikely to bounce back fully. Now, this is not a uniquely British problem, but as it stands, it takes the average British worker 5 days to produce what the average German, French or American worker does in 4.
Philip Hammond is trying to increase productivity. He's pledged money to improve roads and railways. And he's investing in skills and training, as well as maths and computing in schools. Leeds is supposed to be part of a northern powerhouse, but the developer building offices and homes on this site feels shortchanged.
The Chancellor's clearly aware of the need to invest in infrastructure. He's committed £7 billion to the Oxford-Cambridge axis and £1.7 billion to the Northern Powerhouse. And I think the Northern Powerhouse deserves and needs much more recognition and commitment to be able to deliver the infrastructure that's required.
Lower future productivity growth also kicks a sizable hole in the public finances. The OBR predicts that government borrowing will fall consistently over the next 5 years, but over that period the Chancellor will have to borrow £29 billion more than forecast in March. And while he's likely to hit the targets he set to reduce borrowing and debt as a percentage of GDP, the OBR doesn't think he'll be able to balance the budget by the middle of the next decade.
Well, at the moment, we have him getting the budget deficit no lower than 1% and a bit of GDP by the end of our forecast in 2022-23. If you had the sort of improvement that we have at the end of our forecast, the budget probably wouldn't be balanced until 2030 rather than 2025.
The OBR believes the productive capacity of the economy has been permanently lowered. We are suffering the equivalent of serious engine trouble. The problem is no one knows what caused it or quite how it can be fixed. Joel Hills, News at 10.
Now, here's a startling take from the budget. The Resolution Foundation, a family policy think tank, reckons that pay growth is now so weak that disposable incomes will be £540 lower in 2022, as against a forecast only made a few months ago in March. And even more eye-popping, get this, annual pay is not set to return to its 2008 level until the middle of the next decade. If true, it means workers in Britain will have faced a 17-year pay downturn in real terms. And Joel is here now. Joel, that's what we're dealing with. Look, this was supposed to be the moment, wasn't it, when everything was getting better? We've been through the pain, economies elsewhere are growing in the industrialised world. What is going on here?
Well, what's going on is that lower future productivity growth is likely to mean lower future economic growth, lower tax revenues for the Chancellor, lower pay rises for the rest of us, and then therefore lower living standards as a result. Obviously, it's bad news for the Chancellor. We've seen what impact it's likely to have on the money that he has to borrow. As the Resolution Foundation points out, it's going to put a squeeze on disposable income that just continues for a period of time now that feels really quite unprecedented. You've seen in real terms the impact it's going to have on people. The OBR says that prices will rise faster than pay this year and next now. So that squeeze is likely to continue. And you're quite right. We're seeing a situation now where our growth forecasts are being downgraded at the same time that those of the other advanced economies, they seem to be shuffling up through the gears. Economic growth in the UK so far this year has been weaker than it has been in Japan, in America, in Canada, and, whisper it, the euro area.
OK, it's not what everyone wants to hear, but there we are. It is where we are tonight. Now, the cheering from Conservative MPs about the cut in stamp duty for first-time buyers had barely died down before housing experts were predicting the measure would actually end up pushing up prices. More first-time buyers would want to have a place of their own, increasing demand. It was part of a much wider £44 billion plan offering help for housing.
It was supposed to be a budget for home ownership, yet tonight the Chancellor faces tricky questions about who will really benefit, buyers or sellers. For years, this 24-year-old has struggled to catch up with Southampton's runaway housing market.
It's quite modern, it's very open.
But escaping stamp duty only goes so far.
It could still take me quite a long time to save for a deposit. Could take a number of years. I want to know this is still available to me at the time when I do go to buy a place.
From midnight, stamp duty is abolished in England, Wales and Northern Ireland for first-time buyers. From April, Wales gets devolved powers. Homes up to £300,000 outside London are affected. In the capital, it'll include the first £300,000 for a property up to £500,000. But the sting in the tail came with a prediction that it will only lead to an increase of 3,500 buyers and that house prices could rise by 0.3% by this time next year. So a £200,000 house would cost £600 more.
We're building 600 new homes a year at the moment.
This builder fears that changes to stamp duty and other initiatives for buyers will push up prices for those already struggling to get on the housing ladder.
The problem is all the research says that prices go up. So the advantages of Help to Buy are absorbed by higher prices, and that's not helping anybody.
Owners of empty homes could face double council tax. And there's even a promise to halve rough sleeping within 5 years. The Chancellor wants the number of new homes to go up to 300,000 a year by the middle of the 2020s. That's an increase from the just over 200,000 new homes last year. But it's way short of peak house building when 378,000 homes were built back in 1969.
First-time buyer?
Yeah.
OK, let's take some details.
Estate agents say their first-time buyers could save up to £5,000 due to the stamp duty holiday, but some concede that prices could be inflated by the policy.
I don't think they'll soar significantly. As I say, you might see a small short-term uplift.
With properties still out of reach for millions, many also believe a true solution is beyond the grasp of our politicians. Chris Choi, News at 10.
The £2.8 billion for the health service in England was, it has to be said, rather short of the £4 billion its bosses had wanted. That said, they gave it a conditional welcome, but in the same breath put themselves on a collision course, or what seemed like it, with the government. One NHS executive said there would now have to be a debate about what the public can and cannot expect from the NHS. While there was extra NHS funding, there was nothing for social care, and yet many experts do agree they should go hand in hand now.
This is the scene in the liver ward at Birmingham Children's Hospital just as the Chancellor sat down. A difficult time for this baby and his mum, but at least they have a bed.
And he's not going anywhere, are you?
Tonight there is disappointment in this hospital, but grave concern at the top of the NHS that they will now have to reduce care.
I don't think the budget has really reassured me that some of these pressures are recognised. It is good that we've got some extra capital and that's much needed, but we haven't got the amount of resource that we really need. Not having enough resource makes you inefficient. So if you take the Children's Hospital this week, we're doing very little routine surgery. We've had to cancel those operations so that all the patients requiring admission from the emergency department can get a bed.
And that's a view echoed by the outgoing medical director of NHS England, Sir Bruce Keogh. He tweeted his personal view after the Chancellor's statement. The budget plugs some, but definitely not all, of NHS funding gap, worrying that longer waits seem likely or unavoidable. The NHS in England will get an extra £1.6 billion next year, with the rest to follow in 2019, totalling around £2.8 billion. But this is short of the £4 billion demanded by the NHS for next year alone. In previous years, the health budget received an extra 4% a year above inflation to help it cope with an ageing population and treatment costs.
The doctors and nurses in this place will be pretty unhappy with the budget made earlier in that place. It was more than they expected. It's just it wasn't as much as they needed. Now, NHS bosses have been clear. Waiting lists will lengthen and operations will be cancelled, even though the public has made clear in recent polling that it wanted the NHS to be the #1 focus in the budget.
The Health Secretary leaving Downing Street this morning before the budget. He had been arguing behind the scenes for more NHS cash, and today's funding boost is slightly better than predicted.
The government recognises it is our most important public service. It's under a lot of pressure. And what the NHS said to us is, look, you may not be able to solve all the funding pressures in the NHS in this budget, but please recognise some of our immediate concerns and immediate pressures, which is what this does.
Away from the wards, all eyes now turn to the meeting next week of NHS England. They said today they'll now have to decide what care somewhere like Birmingham Children's Hospital can continue to offer after the budget. It's clear healthcare across the UK in 2018 and beyond will now be quite different. Allegra Stratton, News at 10.
Let's just take a quick look now at some of the other main budget details. The duty on beer, wine, spirits and most ciders will be frozen, but duty on high-strength white ciders will go up from 2019. Tobacco duty will continue to rise at 2% above inflation from today, making the average pack of cigarettes £10.50, the most expensive in Europe. For another year in a row, the planned fuel duty rise has been scrapped. However, the Chancellor will increase the excise duty for diesel cars that do not meet latest standards from next April, but that does not apply to van owners. Keep up, keep up. The national living wage is going up 4.4% to £7.83 an hour from April, from £7.50. So a lot in the round. Let's recap with our political editor, Robert Peston. You and I were covering from the first moment of the coalition, the defining purpose said to be, which was, you know, balancing the books, which we were supposed to do by 2015. Today we're told maybe 2030, possibly, who knows. I mean, what is the defining purpose? I mean, is this austerity gone, abandoned? What do you make of today?
Well, the defining purpose of the government has got nothing to do with austerity anymore. It's, you know, getting us out of the European Union. I mean, we shouldn't forget that after the crisis of 2008, the deficit swelled to 10%. It's now heading down, it's below 3, it's heading down to 1. Deficits aren't intrinsically bad. The issue for governments is what they do with the money. And look, the political reality is that after that general election, when so many Tory MPs said that they found themselves hated on the doorstep, they couldn't continue to cut public services at the same rate. They also have a health service screaming for more resources. And so, you know, as I said earlier on today, austerity has been effectively abandoned at a time when the economy is not growing as fast as one had expected. Rather than cutting back, they are actually spending without putting up taxes. That, in a technical sense, is the end of austerity.
OK, but it seems as if this went down quite well, actually. You know, as you say, quite some of his party wanted him to effectively ditch austerity. Others wanted more money for Brexit. He kind of did both, did he?
Well, short term, it has gone down quite well. But, you know, the fundamental problems remain. I've said that the deficit is down, but the national debt is well over 80% of GDP. It's falling slightly. It is not inconceivable there will be another economic shock of a magnitude of the sort we saw only a few years ago. You add another 20 to 30 to 40 percentage points of debt onto the current level, and Britain is in a terrible mess. Secondly, and this is very, very important, we don't know what kind of Brexit deal we've got. We have got economic forecasts of lower growth on the basis of an OK Brexit deal. It will be terrible for the government if those growth forecasts fall even more because of a bad Brexit.
Okay, putting my hands in front of my eyes at this point. Let's see. Thank you, Robert.
The budget headline, Britain isn't quite the strong economy we'd hoped or thought. And that's official. The 6th biggest economy in the world, the Chancellor told us, not the 5th, as it's sometimes described by his colleagues. Our new budget forecasts predict growth over the next 5 years to be lacklustre, less than 2% all the way. Pathetic is a term that comes to mind. Not that you would have thought so from the early paragraphs of Philip Hammond's speech, with an upbeat description of Britain's ability to benefit from the white heat of a new technology revolution.
For the first time in decades, Britain is genuinely at the forefront of this technological revolution. Not just in our universities and research institutes, but this time in the commercial development labs of our great companies and on factory floors and business parks across this land. But we must invest to secure that bright future for Britain. And at this budget, that is what we choose to do.
Well, park that thought, because we soon had to get into the nitty-gritty. And 2 big things stuck out for me. First, that low growth. It's all about productivity, the amount we produce for an hour of work. Now, in the past, productivity just tended to go up as we tend to get better at things. But just look here at the graph. When the financial crash came, productivity fell right back. And for years now, the OBR have been forecasting that it'll bounce back. These are the last few forecasts, and you can see how they all point upward. But actual productivity simply stagnated. Those forecasts were wrong. So now the OBR scaled back its expectations. And from that, all other bad news follows. Borrowing, for example, is not coming down nearly as fast as the Chancellor wanted. And this is not just a temporary recession, nor is this Brexit. That could still muck everything up, as the forecast currently assumes it'll all go fairly smoothly. No, this is a downgrading of our economic potential. The productivity bounce back is like an awkward date. You wait for them to show up at the restaurant, but after 10 years you decide they're probably not coming.
The OBR has assumed at each of the last 16 fiscal events that productivity growth would return to its pre-crisis trend of about 2% a year, but it has remained stubbornly flat. So today, they revised down the outlook for productivity growth, business investment and GDP growth across the forecast period.
Well, that line was more important than pretty well everything else in the speech combined. But a second striking feature of this budget concerns public spending and austerity. Now, after the last 6 elections, we've had big tax rises to pay for extra public spending. Not this time. We've just had an election, but in an historic shift, no tax rise. And yet we still have spending cuts baked in to our plans. Sizable spending cuts. Here's the graph, per capita spending on government services from 2015 to 2022. Now, when you look at that, from where we are, is that really doable? Today, the Chancellor bunged some billions into the public sector to ease the pain in the next couple of years, but he's still budgeting on pain later. Well, that's 2 big themes. There's a lot more to talk about, notably $3 billion for Brexit and lots on housing. But here is Nick Watt with his take on the day.
We've known him as Spreadsheet Phil, the cautious and rather dull guardian of the nation's public finances. But after that hammering at the general election, did a new spendthrift Phil step onto the stage? The Chancellor unveiled what the Treasury billed as an extra $25 billion in spending and an easing of taxes over the next 5 years.
This has been a wretched year for the government after Theresa May lost her parliamentary majority in June. The Tories were deeply unsettled by Labour's success in winning over younger voters who believe austerity has had its day. And then there are the warring Brexit factions who are overshadowing the work of this government and putting one minister in the firing line.
So today, Philip Hammond needed to reset the dial for the Tories by reasserting his own authority and making clear he hears that cry of frustration in June.
We are listening and we understand the frustration of families where real incomes are under pressure. So at this budget, we choose a balanced approach. Yes, maintaining fiscal responsibility as we at last see our debt peaking. Continuing to invest in the skills and infrastructure that will support the jobs of the future. Building the homes that will make good on our promise to the next generation.
Jeremy Corbyn thought the budget had failed its first test, improving the lives of ordinary people.
Utter complacency about the crisis facing our public services and complacent about the reality of daily life for millions of people in this country. Entirely out of touch with that reality of life for millions.
Well, this had the trappings of a normal budget day, but there was a different feel. The Chancellor's team were very keen to talk up the extra spending, and in language that would have been unthinkable until relatively recently, they talked about a fiscal loosening. So is this Chancellor really turning on the taps? Well, the answer to that, in the words of Evelyn Waugh, is up to a point, Lord Copper.
This budget does mark a limited net giveaway to help the economy after the dramatic downgrade in growth forecasts, with measures such as the abolition of stamp duty for most first-time buyers. But their net takeaways are pencilled in for the early part of the next decade.
The big news in the budget was really the first few minutes when he explained that the growth forecasts have been downgraded. That has massive knock-on implications, far less government revenue, higher public borrowing, and a decline in people's living standards beyond what they were led to expect before the election, by about £700 a head at the end of the Parliament.
There was a mixed reception amongst Tory MPs. Some were, well, a little underwhelmed. But I spoke to one leading Brexit supporter who told me I am delighted with this budget, and I was hoping to get rid of Philip Hammond just a few weeks ago. But the Chancellor faces a delicate balancing act as he seeks to win back those younger voters who believe austerity has had its day. He needs to spend in a way that does not spook the market, but he needs to deliver change with enough of a flourish that the Tories get the credit. A mini-me Labour budget would probably rebound.
I think this budget effectively did not go in for Corbyn light. That's what I most feared, that he'd listened to some of the dafter voices lobbying, trying to press him to give in to as many lobbies as possible to try to buy a few votes. Corbyn light, even Corbyn light, is not affordable. First, get the economy on a sustainable reasonable path, then decide how best to spend the revenues that will produce. If he was just handing out money today, I'd have been very worried indeed.
One Labour critic of Jeremy Corbyn thought the budget failed the challenge set by her party at the election.
There's nothing really hopeful or inspiring about today's budget. There is nothing that says we're going to get productivity going up. This is a country about to get up and start looking after itself. Actually, what it is growth is down and productivity is down and spending cuts have caused growth to be down. So it's just more of the same, lack of hope from a hopeless government.
Philip Hammond has for now earned a reprieve with a budget that was relatively well received on the Tory benches. But budgets that go down well on day one can often run into trouble down the line.
Nick Watt there, we'll hear a bit more from him later. But when chancellors get punished for budget mishaps, it tends not to be the really bad news that gets them, the downgrade of growth or whatever. It's usually the specific measures that entangle them in knots. Today, the specific measures that were the headline grabbers related to housing, getting the young who feel shut out of the housing market back in love with the Tories, perhaps. Our business editor, Helen Thomas, is here to talk about that. Also is Chris Cook, who's been looking at the NHS and public spending. Chris, let's start with you. The NHS, not cracking open the champagne.
Well, I think you can forgive a little bit of irritation in Whitehall with NHS leaders today. They have put in about £2 billion next year. They put in a further £3.6 billion over the rest of the Parliament in capital. The slight problem is that the NHS had already made clear that they thought they wanted £4 billion to make the sums add up next year and about £10 billion of capital over the rest of the Parliament to modernise the estate and to make sure the hospitals can keep up with the ever-rising demand for healthcare. The thing is, though, the NHS has this very odd structure these days. We have a chief executive of the NHS, Simon Stevens. We have a chair of NHS England, Sir Malcolm Grant. And they're independent, and they're allowed to do what they like. And they have started openly campaigning for more money. So we've got this rather odd thing. They've just been given £2 billion next year, £3.6 billion over the rest of the Parliament. And Sir Malcolm Grant has put out a statement today saying the extra money the Chancellor has found for the NHS is welcome, but he says we can no longer avoid the difficult debate about what is possible to deliver for patients with the money available. They're going to have a board meeting to discuss what they do and don't do on November the 30th.
Wow. Well, that's
pretty big.
That's big news.
Yeah.
What about, just very briefly, the rest of public spending? Because there is a squeeze coming to quite a few departments.
There is.
Even though they've had one for a few years.
And the critical thing, really, is we don't know where it's going to go at all, because there's a sort of cliff edge in the budget beyond which we know nothing really about public spending, and huge amounts of the pain is concentrated in those mystery years.
Right. Chris, thanks. Well, Helen, eye-catching measures on housing, a stamp duty, removal of stamp duty people for young first-time buyers, perhaps?
Exactly, it was the headline grabber. So there's zero stamp duty for buyers of properties up to £300,000, and you can even save for up to £5,000 on a property for up to £500,000. So this is a bit sticky in a few ways. I mean, firstly, Ed Miliband proposed a very similar policy back in 2015, and the Conservatives called it a gimmick, and they said it had been tried before and failed. And indeed, the Office for Budget Responsibility said today that when it has been tried before, the savings have basically been incorporated into higher house prices, and that it hasn't really helped affordability. And it's also worth thinking a little bit about who's helped. So the average first-time buyer, the purchase price is £210,000, so they'll save about £1,700. The bigger saving is for buyers of more expensive properties. And if you're in a part of the country with much lower house prices, plenty of properties for under £125,000, which was the old threshold, doesn't change things.
But look, one of the things they've said is the real measures have to get the supply of housing up, and there was a lot in the budget. At the end of the budget, there's a sort of rabbit.
There was. Again, a big headline number was £44 billion in support for the housing market. Now, actually, only about £15 billion of that is new measures announced today. The rest was already out there. And most of that, when you look at it, was either loans or loan guarantees, especially to sort of new builders, so private sector builders. Now, when you come down to cold, hard cash, new government spending announced today was about £6 billion over 5 years. So that sounds slightly less impressive. What I will say, though, is that the housing experts I've spoken to
quite like some of the areas that money's going into. So they like the signs of a more robust approach to assembling land for development and using local authority powers, and they like this definite focus on resuscitating the smaller end of the house building market.
OK, thanks. Well, this government's had a turbulent time in recent weeks. Brexit is basically one concession to the Europeans after another, and there is a sense among critics of a lack of vision about that and more, a government treading time to see where things will go. So does this budget show a government with a direction? I'm joined by Liz Truss, who's Philip Hammond's deputy, Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Also with us is Peter Dowd, her Labour opposite number. We'll come to you in a minute, Peter. Let me start with Liz Truss. Can we start on that housing? The Office for Budget Responsibilities say, on the stamp duty measure, the main gainers from the policy are the people who already own property, not the first-time buyers themselves, because your measure will push up the prices, so the owners benefit, not the buyers.
I think lots of people are struggling to get on the housing ladder. There are many people in their 20s and 30s who previously would have been able to buy a home, now finding it much more difficult. And of course, we need to increase the supply of homes, and that's what all these measures are about, and getting up to 300,000. But we really felt it was necessary to do something now to help those who have struggled for a number of years. And that's what this measure is about.
But you're not helping them if you simply push the price of houses up as much as you're saving on stamp duty.
People will not have to pay that tax up to 300,000. They'll have a reduction up to 500,000, and that is cash that you're not having to pay to the tax man.
But you're paying the higher house price, aren't you? Can I ask, do you agree with the statement by the Office for Budget Regulation that the main gainers are people who already own property?
I think the main gainers are people who will now be able to buy their own home and get on the housing ladder.
So you don't agree with them on who the main gainers are?
Well,
you disagree. You're saying something different. They did not say the main gainers are first-time buyers. They said they're people who own property.
Well, that is who we are aiming to help.
I know you're aiming, but I'm saying, do you disagree with their analysis? Because you accept their analysis on everything else.
Their analysis suggests that overall the impact on house prices will be 0.3%.
But the main gainers
that is a minor increase, Evan. And what we're looking at overall...
It's just the main gainers are the people who own property, not the ones buying it.
But the people we want to help are those people who we're exempting from tax.
Why did the Tory party
and they will get a cash gain.
Why did the Tory party say it was a panicky, unfunded announcement? It failed last time it was tried, when Labour tried it, when Labour suggested it in the 2015 election.
Well, this is a funded announcement. Our budget package is fully funded.
Okay.
And we face a...
You said it was a panicky, you called it a gimmick, and you said it failed. Why would you pick up something that Labour did 2 years ago, you suggested 2 years ago, you said was a failure? Actually, the Treasury announcement says when it was tried before, it's not had a significant impact in improving affordability for first-time buyers. Basically, the Tory party, the Treasury, the Office for Budget Responsibility, they all say it's stupid.
We absolutely accept that the big issue here is supply.
Right.
And we need to expand supply, but there is a need in the short term to help people out, Evan, because people are struggling, and we have recognised that they are struggling with getting on the ladder.
Are we not in an era, really? What you're actually saying by refusing to entertain the notion that not helping people is not a way of helping them, aren't we just really in an era where you're just making gestures to try and show that you care and you listen? And it doesn't matter whether it works, it's what it says, because we know it doesn't work, because all these people who
Evan,
you trust say it doesn't work.
I'm a believer in low taxation. I think if we can exempt people from taxes, if we can lower taxes for hard-pressed people, we've done it on the personal allowance, where we're giving basic rate taxpayers £1,000 off what they would have paid. I think that's a good thing, and it's the right thing for a Conservative government to be doing.
And nice for homeowners. Look, let's move on. Let's move on to spending. We just heard Chris there saying NHS sitting down, they're independent of government now, they run the show, and saying they need to work out what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. What would be your advice over what the NHS should stop doing as a result of them not being able to do everything with these funds?
So clearly we do understand there are pressures in the NHS. We've seen a big increase in the number of people going to A&E, a big increase in the number having operations, and there is pressure on the NHS. And it's why, whilst keeping to our fiscal rules, which is incredibly important, we have found that extra money for the NHS. We've also said that we will look at funding for a package for nurses and other NHS workers as well, because we recognise how hard those people work, and we do want to be able to. So
what would
this
you not
is
do?
why
Because
we
they
have
say
made.
they can't do everything on the budget that they're given at the moment. What would you like them to stop doing in order to stick to the difficult budget you've had to assign them?
Well, a lot of the money we're putting in is actually capital to be able to modernise NHS facilities, and that should enable the NHS to improve its productivity and be able to do more, and that's the whole purpose of that capital funding.
So you think they can do everything?
So we're giving them some money to help
and the
in the early years, and then we're giving the capital money to help transform the service so they can do more.
So when it comes to things like the NHS targets, which have on waiting times in A&E, which you know are just being failed all the time everywhere in England at the moment, is there a chance that we will start meeting those targets?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Because I think they're going to say we can't do it on this money.
Certainly
Are they wrong?
I'm not saying they're wrong, absolutely not. But what I am saying is the money we are putting in should help us reach those targets. And that's why we are putting the money in, and we've looked at how that will help achieve those targets in conjunction with that extra money we're putting into modern facilities, and also what we're looking at on pay as well.
So when do you
for
expect
nurses
to get those,
and other staff.
I know this isn't, you're not health secretary, but you are public spending secretary. When do you think they'll be able to get back into those targets?
Well, this will help make positive progress towards those targets over the next few years.
The Justice budget, and you used to be Justice Secretary,
I did,
has had about 25% real cuts over the last 7 years. It's going to get another 15% or thereabouts. Do you think, seriously, you can cut, say, the Justice budget?
Well, we have
by that amount, when you see what the state of prisons is at the moment and the stretch.
And we have put an extra 100 million into prisons every year, and we are successfully recruiting more prison officers. So we've made real progress in being able to get more prison officers. There are now more in our prisons, and I think it's fair to say the situation
I don't think you're
has
answering my
stabilised,
question.
Evans.
Do you think you could take, if you were Justice Secretary, 15% out of that budget without shocking conditions in prisons?
Well,
that's the policy at the moment. I'm just wondering whether you think you could deliver it.
Well, what I've said is we did actually put in an extra 100 million to deal with those staffing issues.
So they'll put money in, they won't make the 15% cut that is currently the policy.
But there are ways in different public services, and it varies from schools to hospitals, of doing things like using modern technology, cutting out some of the paperwork and processes.
So you can cut out paperwork.
So, for example, can I give you an example?
After the 20... But then why are the salts going up in prisons and staff?
Let me give you an example of the police force. So I recently had a visit with Norfolk Constabulary. I went out with them. They now use modern technology, body-worn cameras. They're able to do interviews on site. They don't need to go back to the police station. They've got a forensic van. They can do investigations. They can do those things more efficiently. And that's great for people working in the public services because they're spending more of their time working on the front line and they're able to deliver that service more efficiently.
Okay.
But we are very carefully looking at every single public service to make sure they do have the resources they need, which is why we're putting this extra money into the NHS, because we recognise there are very real pressures there.
Very quick, last one, on growth and productivity. Do you think we should get used to these figures, 1 to 1.5% for growth? Is that now the new normal? Would you work on that assumption, or do you expect it to go back to 2%?
I absolutely don't think we should accept that at all. I think we have huge potential in this country. I think we can do better. I think we can upskill. I think we can match our international competitors when it comes to areas like maths and computer science. So I think it will take time. Of course, when we're changing things like the school curriculum or the number of students doing computer science, it takes a while for those people to come through the system. But we've got tremendous things going on in Britain. We've got a record number of startup companies. We've got $22 billion tech companies. And I think we do have a bright future.
Okay,
it's not going to be instant magic, but we should not accept mediocrity. We've got to get better.
Wait there while I talk to Peter Dowd, your Labour opposite number. Peter Dowd, I mean, it all comes back to growth, doesn't it? What was interesting was, in the Labour manifesto, you were spending £48 billion extra, but really none of it was directed towards productivity. Productivity only got 2 mentions in the manifesto.
Well, no, that's not correct, because half that £48 billion was in relation to education from early years through to primary schools, secondary schools, through to further education, into universities and lifelong learning. That is an investment, and that would feed into productivity. Plus the other...
I'm so sorry, the spending on education was mostly about giving money to students, restoring education maintenance allowance, abolishing student fees. That's not going to raise productivity.
No.
Unless you get more students better taught, they're not going to make a difference to productivity.
That was half that particular budget, Evan. That was half that particular budget, and a significant portion of that was in relation to further education, which is exactly where we should be spending money.
That was introducing free tuition, equalising funding. I mean, there was some funding on 16 to 19.
Yes.
But we're talking less than 2 billion. I mean,
yes, but there's that, and on top of that, we then had our capital, our infrastructure spending, the 250 billion. So there were significant amounts there in relation to raising productivity and putting investment into the system. That was there. It was there for everyone to see in the 48.6 billion.
Right. So the productivity relies on infrastructure. Can I ask you about new technology? Because Philip Hammond today made quite a lot, actually, about driverless cars and the potential for a new industrial revolution. And I was wondering if there was a kind of philosophical difference there. He clearly wants Britain to be good at driverless cars. He wants driverless cars to take off in this country. That could destroy tens or hundreds of thousands of jobs of drivers. Do you welcome them or not?
Well, of course I welcome new technology. In fact, the whole of the Industrial Revolution was about new technology, and then we're talking about being in the fourth Industrial Revolution. So, of course, technology is important. You can't stop the advance of technology. That doesn't mean is that people are less well off, that there are less jobs. I'm sorry, I don't accept that proposition.
So what is the policy on, say, on driverless cars? Because you agree with him promoting driverless cars. What do you do to all the drivers at the moment?
Well, the issue is there are suggestions that in the future there are jobs which we don't know, which don't exist now, that will exist in the future. We don't even know what some of those jobs actually are. So the idea that all these people lose jobs and they're not going to be replaced with other jobs, you only have to look at Singapore and the development of technology there and the growth levels there and the employment levels there. So they're not mutually exclusive.
Can I ask about your tax numbers? Because again, I mean, in fairness to you, you've been very open that you want higher taxes. Criticism of the Labour position on taxes is that while you say you want higher taxes, you pretend that no one is going to feel them because they're only going to be paid by companies or a very small number of very wealthy people. The Institute for Fiscal Studies have essentially said you can't raise 50 billion just from companies because those companies will either pay their workers less or charge their customers more or pay out less to pensioners who are shareholders and rely on the income from them. Is it time to admit that those costings will hit ordinary people as well as just companies and the rich?
Well, I don't think it is time to admit that because I don't believe that. The issue is we did set out absolutely transparently in our Funding Britain's Future, that 48.6 billion, and where we were going to raise that money from. And we do believe that it will affect only 5% in terms of income taxpayers, and the rest of the funding will come from corporations. For example, let's take an example in relation to corporation tax. It was at 26%. The government are proposing to bring it down to 17%. We're taking it to 26%, and we will still be the lowest in the G7.
Somebody is going to bear that, isn't it? Either the shareholders or the workers or the customers are somehow going to be worse off, aren't they? That's the point. There's no such thing as a company independent of actual people who run
there's an issue there about growth in the economy. That's the whole point, isn't it? You raise productivity, you put investment into the economy, you raise productivity, people get high wages, there's more profit. That's where the growth comes from in relation to the tax we gain.
Brings us all back to growth. Both of you would very much like that. Thank you very much indeed. Now, it's a grand tradition on budget days to ask what the public reaction is. We've had a government in a mess for the last few weeks and public services struggling. So has the Chancellor done anything to get the show back on the road? Emily has been in Bury today with a focus group selected for us by a small market research company. The panel was drawn from the local area and designed to be politically mixed. Some voted Conservative last time, some Labour, and some didn't vote at all. Now, these focus groups can never offer a scientific study of public sentiment, but they do offer a rich guide as to how things are playing out.
Lynette, I'm going to come to you. You picked up a few bits and bobs. What were the things that jumped out at you?
Interesting for me was more money for the NHS. I think that's something that we really need at the moment. Also, the increase in the minimum wage. It's only a small increase, but it's helping for people in this kind of economic climate. And also I think raising the tax thresholds, I think the basic tax threshold has gone up a little bit, and also the 40%, it's kind of gone up ever so slightly, so I think that's
You work
helped.
part-time, so that's helpful for you.
Yeah, I think especially with the basic tax, I think that definitely helps along with the minimum wage. It just helps push things up a little bit.
Was anyone disappointed by what they heard today? Was there something that you were holding out for that you didn't hear?
Yes. I overall was impressed by the budget speech, but I did want to hear something about gambling and trying to solve this problem of addictive gambling, and I thought it was a bad opportunity missed by the Chancellor today.
Can I ask the younger ones here whether they responded to the first-time buyers announcement at all? Is that going to make a difference to your life if you don't have to pay stamp duty up to £300,000 on a house you're buying?
Yeah, I think it will help quite a lot. Obviously, as a first-time buyer, 300,000 is actually obviously quite a lot of money. But I'm looking to buy a house into the next year, and it will help quite a lot.
I find it a lot easier because it is hard now these days to save up enough deposit to put towards your first-time house and all. But the only problem is that they're saying that they are going to build more houses for us and all, but are they affordable for people like us and all? Yeah. Are they just for the more people that earn more money, you know?
It's whether they get built as well, because they've promised to build more houses before in previous budgets and never built them. Yeah. I think it was 200,000 a few years ago and they never built them.
So who doesn't believe the house building promise?
I don't believe it.
I think it's quite unrealistic for what they say.
I think they should try to free up local authorities to build. I think that would make a big impression because they would build social housing. And I don't see any route to social housing being built that has been mentioned in the budget today.
Social housing that wouldn't be privately purchased then?
Correct.
Right.
But they need to reduce the amount of bureaucracy as well.
The old council house, they were all built by the local authorities, and that's just not happened for many years now, and there's an opportunity today to do that.
Let me ask how many of you are still living with parents, or parents, how many of you have still got children living with you? Just put your hand up if that's...
I have 2 daughters and a son. They're all at one's just finished a degree, one is now a teacher, and the other one is living at home. He's at college.
And do you think this will help any of your kids buy their own homes?
I hope so. I really do hope so. For them to be able to buy their own home would be something that we'd certainly be looking for.
Adam, I know you said that you're trying to buy next year.
I just think it's not necessarily obviously they've reduced it, but I think it's the deposit's the big thing. That's the difficult thing in getting on the property ladder now.
Saskia, you're still living at home.
Yeah, I'm still living at home, and I often think that compared to some people, I think I'm quite fortunate because I never went to university and stuff, and I just think for some of my friends who are at uni and they're gonna they finish uni and they've still got so much money that they owe, then they're going to be stuck at home for such a long time because deposits to put down on a house are just enormous.
And you would be looking to buy your own now, would you?
Yeah.
Would anything in the budget change your plans for the next year, do you think, or not yet?
I don't know all about it, but it's optimistic, to hear that they are doing something about it. They are aware that this it's a massive struggle for some people.
Well, let me pick up on that now. Who could tell me the hardest thing in their life at the moment that the budget did or didn't address? Yeah.
My mum is an Alzheimer's sufferer. Yeah. She's currently in care. She's living in a place via Valley, which is a housing trust, but she's trying to be rehomed at the moment, and the system is just collapsing. It's falling apart. And although there was mention of money for the NHS, there wasn't any specific mention of money for social care, and particularly elderly social care. And just being in that loop, I know that system is ready to collapse.
Just think more money for or being specifically allocated for mental health. I think it's a really big issue at the moment, and I think just mental health services are really stretched at the moment, waiting lists, and I just think it needs to really specify which areas that they're going to be spent.
Who else would agree with that?
Well, I agree with that, but I think also other conditions and disabilities such as autism are not catered for enough. I mean, I work in autism, and I know that measures aren't there to assist, particularly the more challenging
Right.
people.
So you'd like to see more money in the NHS for social care, for disability, for mental health as well. Let me ask you this question then. Would you be prepared to see your own taxes go up to fund better provision of these services? Just raise your hand so we get a sense.
One of the things I was
That's amazing. All of you are saying now that you'd be prepared to pay more taxes.
As long as we can be confident that it is being spent properly,
yeah,
and it is not being misspent in different areas.
It's like the alcohol duty being frozen, I think, is a mistake, because that's a revenue stream that we can get. It's a luxury, you know, people can afford it or they can't. And I think to freeze it, to sort of go for the bottom end and then to freeze the alcohol duty, for me, smells of a vote winner, because a lot of the people, because you mentioned whiskey, so specifically that sort of thing. But then also I think it maybe sends out the wrong message where you're trying to get people to drink responsibly. We have a problem, you know, we're not really addressing it.
And you say this because you mentioned to me you're a drinker and a driver. I know not at the same time, but you do both, and yet you disagree with the freeze on duty.
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously the fuel is slightly different because of the industry and everything, and I understand that. But I do definitely think that the tax and duty on alcohol should have been increased.
So I find that extraordinary. Did the Chancellor then miss a trick? If you've all said you don't mind paying more taxation, you've all said that as long as it's going in the right place. So he could have actually raised money to pay for the things that you all want today.
Well, he's a politician, isn't he? He's got to be very careful.
I think
he can't do what he maybe wants to do. Raising taxes would you know, perhaps lose him an election or something like that.
I think most people expect alcohol to go up. I think it's almost a given. And I think to not put it up is almost like a sort of, oh, but nobody really goes, oh, that's brilliant. I don't pay 2 pence more for a... But if you'd raised £10 billion to spend on the NHS, then we would have all gone, OK, fair enough.
People are much more socially aware as well, aren't they? So people have a better understanding of how that money could be better spent on, you know, our public servants, our public sector, right across the board.
Let me just ask you a really unfair question. At the end of today, who would feel inclined to vote for this budget, to vote Conservative at the next election if it were called next week, on the basis of what you've heard in the budget?
Well, I would.
Just put your hand up. OK. Who would say they've been put off by what they've heard today? And we've got 4 undecideds. Thank you all very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Emily in Bury today. Well, let's finish today with some budget reflections with a panel of big brains and years of experience. Rupert Harrison was Chief of Staff to George Osborne at the Treasury, now works for BlackRock. Fraser Nelson is editor of The Spectator. And Faiza Shaheen is the director at the Centre for Labour and Social Studies. We'll get to them in a moment. Nick Watt is back here first, though. And Nick, everyone's in the bars tonight, digesting and drinking their sorrows or cheering their joy. What's the gossip?
Well, it's interesting. I was talking to one member of the Cabinet, and this is someone who's relatively a fan of Philip Hammond, who said, at last, we've got a political Philip Hammond. Because obviously there was the disaster of his budget earlier this year when his sort of poor political antennae got into trouble on national insurance for self-employed. And this member of the Cabinet was saying, yes, you could see everything he was doing, the job he needs to do, which is answer that roar that persuaded people to vote Labour back in June. And interestingly, quite a lot of the Brexiteers reasonably happy.
Let's just take a quick look at the newspaper headlines tomorrow. Financial Times, grim outlook, overshadows housing drive. The Guardian, Hammond struggles to lift the gloom. OK, so 2 with a slightly sort of gloomy air about them. The Times, though, goes Hammond eases off austerity. And the Mail is perhaps the most interesting. The Mail dubbed the gloomy Chancellor Eeyore. Today, after his Brexit optimism is boost for housing, the young and nurses, we rescind the nickname. Eeyore no more. What do you make of that?
I do think that's significant. You know, the verb rescind, we're taking it away. And you say, as you point out, that they're saying we like what he does, housing and nurses, but crucially, they like his Brexit optimism. So as long as he appears to be saying the right thing for the Daily Mail, they'll be happy.
Nick, thanks. OK, panel. First of all, is this the end of austerity? Because some are writing this up as the end of austerity. Fraser?
Yes, it is pretty much. Have a look at the deficit forecast. They've given up even pretending we're going to balance the books someday. It's being stretched off forever into the future. And instead, we've had lots of spending without any indication where the money is going to come from. So what they've done is thought, OK, Jeremy Corbyn isn't going to tease us for running up a massive debt. So we're in a political hole, so let's dig our way out of it, but lots of borrowed money. That's effectively what we saw today.
Vida, have they given up on austerity?
Well, I think there's got to be a recognition that austerity hasn't worked when you've missed so many of your deficit reduction targets, and when economic growth is downgraded again. You've got to start thinking that this isn't the right approach. Saying that, the real end of austerity would be to start undoing some of those cuts. And we had a little bit about that.
We've got more to come.
Exactly.
I mean,
so in essence, they haven't. They're still parroting the same narrative about austerity is the right thing and fiscal responsibility, rather than using this opportunity to invest.
But do you think, essentially, this is the key, that Jeremy Corbyn's relative success against expectations in the general election has spooked them, and they basically said we need to throw a bit of money at stuff? Is that your take?
Yeah, there were some gestures there, but they are just gestures, right? The problems that they created themselves. Homelessness has gone up, doubled since they've been leading government, and so they throw some money at it. They're undoing the damage they've done. So, I mean, I'm not going to clap about that.
Rupert, you were there running it when austerity was the name of the game. Do you feel like this is a kind of a significant change in direction?
Well, as budgets go, it's spent quite a lot of money. So, you know, he's spending tens of billions of pounds more. You know, normally that would be seen as a pretty expensive budget for the public finances. The big picture, though, is very much not the end of austerity. Government budgets are still very, very tight for some years to come. There's very difficult decisions, like a benefit freeze, for example, that's stretching several years ahead. So it's absolutely not the end of austerity. I think they have paused their level of ambition. I think that's partly for the politics and partly on the economics, that right now with Brexit uncertainty isn't the time to be doubling down.
Does this, to any of you, feel like a government with a kind of a real vision of what it's doing or where it wants to go? Because he said this is not a budget about Brexit, it's about a lot more than Brexit. Did you really get the sense that they've got a kind of a picture?
I thought he did a better job of telling the government story, focusing on house building and also talking about the progressive nature of the government's reforms, income inequality, lowest in 30 years, the top of the 1%, so the richest 1% paying 27% of income tax. These are real progressive achievements from successive conservative reforms, and the Tories have been a bit bad about boasting about that. But now they are. So I actually thought that for once he was beginning to point out that this is not just about cutting, this is about building a fairer as well as a stronger country.
Yeah. I mean, it's very difficult to claim that we're a fairer country when we have so many more people going to food banks, when we have those in the rich list seeing their wealth double whilst that has happened.
Inequality has been coming down. So
no, I mean,
the stats say we're a more equal society.
Statistical questions over there. Which measure you use?
That measure of income inequality is very bad at the extremes, both extremes. You can ask the IFS that, and they will tell you that.
It's true at the very top around the world, but the overall measure of inequality in the UK has come down since 2010, and actually the people whose incomes have fallen the most are those people at the top.
I suppose I'm just more interested in what we've basically been saying. The narrative since the election has been this is a leaderless government. It doesn't know what it's doing, where it's going. It's just passing time. Has this game changed?
But the elephant in the room in the short term is Brexit, obviously. I mean, for the economy and for what our country's going to look like for the next few years.
Do we need to abolish
nothing else matters
Brexit? Because we just don't know what anything. All of this is a sort of fantasy league.
Yeah, but this is a statement for the government to try to say something. And the biggest thing today, it hasn't been a disaster, which is more than you can say about the party conference, about the election, about the last budget. But he needed to get through this and it not to implode. And so far, the night is young, but it hasn't.
What a low bar. What a low bar that we have set.
That's where we are right now.
That's what we've set. And meanwhile, we have more nurses, 30% more nurses leaving than joining.
But they're about to get more money from this budget,
88% of education of schools facing real-term
Record numbers of kids in good or outstanding schools?
I mean, listen, when you look at the stats, whether it's child poverty and that relative child poverty is going up, when you look at food bank usage, when you look at homelessness, this is not a sign of a healthy economy.
Rupert, how far do you think this is if not the Jeremy Corbyn kind of nod to him, at least a nod to Ed Miliband? There does seem a lot of Milibandism about this government at the moment.
Yeah, I think it is a nod to Jeremy Corbyn more than Ed Miliband, because Ed Miliband lost an election and Jeremy Corbyn also lost an election, but he gained a lot of seats and he spooked the Tory party. I think some of the spending money on the health service is something that any Conservative government would do, because you want to, I think what Chris Cook was saying earlier about the potential war coming down the line between the NHS England and the government is going to be something to watch, but you're going to have to keep spending money. I mean, your point about vision, I did think that something that Philip Hammond managed to do today, which was just the beginning, was try and give us a picture of that in the long term there are some things that might be more important than Brexit. I said Brexit was the main thing for the next couple of years. I still think that's true. But these new technologies, driverless cars, biotechnology, longer lifespans, These are going to be much more important than Brexit. And he did at least have a long section of the speech and some serious measures trying to talk about science and technology in an interesting way. And I think that was a small achievement.
I mean, it's interesting that, Fraser, from the same sort of end of the political spectrum, Rupert is thinking that Jeremy Corbyn has made quite a lot of running here.
Oh, sure, absolutely. I mean, the spectre of Corbyn now terrifies the Conservatives. 6 months ago, they were laughing at him, so there has been a big change.
But does this work, then? So Ken Clark said it's not Corbyn light, but do you think what he's done kind of shoots the Corbyn fox, the rail cards for 26 to 30-year-olds?
No, I think there are bribes and gimmicks and will be seen as such, but I think we're at the beginnings of a recovery right now. This is not a game changer, but it's beginning to show a government which does know where it's going and has made a few reasonable steps today in getting there.
This was a nothing budget. There was nothing really in it. Like you say, it was gimmicks, it was gestures. And actually, Hammond stood up and said this is about the future and being fit for the future. And then he had nothing, no substance to really start backing that up.
Well, young people start, you know, because a lot of this is designed to get young people back, isn't it? The figures are shocking at the bottom.
I mean, come on, what a stamp duty holiday when young people now are coming out of university with £50,000 of debt.
Do you think it'll work on young people, Rupert?
I don't think it'll work overnight, no, but I don't think we should think about it in that terms. You know, we've very likely got 4 years or more until the next election. This is about steadying the ship. You know, it's about getting a government that is not going to collapse month to month, that can deliver Brexit. And, you know, by the time we have the next election, we're going to have a new leader of the Conservative Party and the world is going to look very different.
A lot of water would have passed under the bridge. Thanks all very much.